In 1982, Missouri citizens voted on a statewide referendum defeating what was then called big trucks. The law would have increased the allowable length and weight of trucks on Missouri highways. Perhaps with their Ouija board turned toward the future, the General Assembly promptly overruled the voters, and by the end of the session in 1982, the legislature had increased the allowable weight and length over the objection of the voters. When the bill reached the desk of Governor Bond, he vetoed it as inconsistent with the right to a meaningful referendum and majority rule. I say Ouija board because the 1982 episode offers some insight into more current events in Missouri politics. In 2003, the General Assembly passed a conceal and carry law after the voters had defeated an earlier conceal and carry referendum. In 2009, the legislature overturned the education funding component of an earlier casino initiative. As some of you may recall, in 2011, the legislature made changes to the so-called puppy mill initiative passed by the voters in 2002. Also in 2011, the General Assembly debated a bill overturning a minimum wage initiative, Proposition B, that was approved by voters in 2006. These events have led to diametrically opposed efforts. On one hand, to make it harder for voters to pass initiatives in the first place, and on the other hand, to make it harder for the General Assembly to overturn citizen-passed initiatives. Whether or not these efforts are successful, only time will tell. Aside from the legislative efforts to overturn these citizen-approved initiatives, there is another parallel between 1982's big trucks and guns, puppies, and the minimum wage that is worth noting. In 1982, big trucks put urban areas of Missouri against rural or outstate voters. This pattern of urban versus rural has been repeated with conceal and carry, the minimum wage, and puppy mills, as well as other statewide votes. The progressives who formulated the initiative process suggested that the collective wisdom of the people would counteract the perceived corruption of the legislature. I think the progressives would be dismayed that their collective wisdom has devolved into a sectional divide. Well, welcome back to Missouri Government. We have covered institutions and constitutions for the most part. Last time we've talked about court cases, the impact of those court cases on national politics as well as state politics. I want to move in a different direction now and talk about participation, mainly you as the citizen of Missouri and the different ways in which you can participate. Now, you remember early in this class, we talked about taking our clipboards down to the library center. So today, mainly we're going to talk about the initiative and referendum process, but I want to take it a little bit beyond that, but it comes down to ways in which you, the individual citizen of Missouri, influence Missouri politics. Okay, so that's the broad overview. I want to talk about statewide ballot issues, just broadly. A little bit of an overview. You get to decide, well, how do those issues get on the ballot in the first place? And bottom line, there are three mechanisms for issues statewide to get on the ballot. I don't think we're going to spend time in this class about the local issue process. We're going to focus on the statewide. Three ways a statewide issue can get on the ballot. The first is the Constitutional Convention. Should Missouri have a new constitutional convention and propose a new state constitution, the citizens of Missouri would have to ratify that. Now, since 1945, in 1962, in 1982, and in 2002, the citizens of Missouri were asked, should we call another constitutional convention? And the answer was No. But built into the 1945 Constitution is this question. Every 20 years, should we or should we not call a new constitutional convention? And thus far, your answer has been no. Well, 20 years in 2022, Janice, you might say enough is enough with this Constitution and we should start again. If that happens, then there would be a statewide issue on the ballot that results from that constitutional convention. Is it going to happen? Probably not, but it's one of the formal mechanisms. The General Assembly, or the legislature, can propose issues to go on a statewide ballot. And they come in two forms: statutes, or basic laws, and the other option would be constitutional amendments. The General Assembly, your elected legislature, can propose statutes and constitutional amendments to put on the ballot for you to decide. The third option is the initiative process. And to oversimplify, that's where you take your clipboard to the Library Center, get signatures on a petition, which we'll talk about in just a second, and something goes on the ballot. Now, you too can propose laws or constitutional amendments. So we've been hammering away at that democracy theme. That's where we introduced this process at the very beginning of the class. You, the citizen of Missouri, have the power to introduce legislation. You also have the power to introduce constitutional amendments. There is a fourth option that also falls to you, and is a form of referenda, and I'm going to come back to this in a second, but it's a form of a referendum on a statute. Let's say the legislature passes a law during the regular session. So, law is passed. You have the power, basically, to take that law back. You can have a statewide vote on that law to overturn it. So, your elected legislature does something that you don't like, a statewide referendum on that law as to whether it's going to stand or not. You have the power to overturn the law passed by the legislature. It was used often in the early 1900s. It was fairly common for the legislature to pass a law and for the citizens of Missouri to overturn it. However, in the last 80 years, give or take, it's only been used 6 times. In the last 80 years, it's only been used 6 times. The last time this statutory referendum was used by the citizens of Missouri was in 1982. So in terms of statewide issues on the ballot, likelihood of happening, the referendum on a statute is not very likely. Constitutional Convention, not very likely. So the most likely place for a statewide ballot issue to come from is from the General Assembly or from initiatives. So these are the two. Now, it is crucial, no matter where this comes from, whether it comes from the Constitutional Convention, whether it comes from the General Assembly in the form of a statute or constitutional amendment, whether it comes from you and your petitions with a statute or constitutional amendment, or if it's a statutory referendum, regardless of how it gets on the ballot, you decide. And again, that's democracy. You're the citizen. We talked about it so many different times. Separately election of lieutenant governor and secretary of state, the retention election of judges. You have more power than the average state citizen. And this is just another example of democracy in action. You have the power. So no matter how it gets on the ballot, there's a statewide referendum as to whether it's going to pass or not. So that is how something gets on the ballot. Okay, Joni, thank you very much. The process itself, we'll talk about the signatures and the petitions right now, but I ran out of room, so I have to erase. Okay, that's the big picture sort of overview of how things get on the ballot. Let me give you a little history lesson, just a short history lesson before we talk about the process itself. Not every state has this process, but a lot of states do. Missouri is not unique in this regard, but you need a little history. The initiative process was adopted in 1907, so it's been around. It's been around for a long time. You have had this democratic authority for quite some time. It is basically in Article 3, which covers the statutes, and Article 12, which would be the constitutional amendment part. Okay, I forgot them already. Article 3, statutes, and Article 12 for the constitutional amendments. So that's where you'll find this material in the Constitution. The very first initiative was passed, very first one, in 1920. So even though you've had the power since 1907, the very first one was passed in 1920. Now, somebody asked earlier about, you know, is there a famous one or most famous one? I think there's probably a most famous two. The most well-known initiatives, historically, something that we've already talked about, 1940, the Missouri Plan, the retention elections, the process we talked about, that was adopted in 1940 over the objections to the legislature through the initiative and referendum process. So that's probably the most famous example of the citizens of Missouri using the initiative. The second example would be 1980 and the Hancock Amendment. Now, a lot of people seem to have forgotten the Hancock Amendment, but it's Missouri's balanced budget amendment. The United States Constitution does not, do you remember the debate over the debt ceiling a couple of years ago? I mean, the United States does not have a balanced budget amendment, but Missouri does. And it's because in 1980, the voters of Missouri added the Hancock Amendment, and it really does two things. The Hancock Amendment specifies that Missouri must have a balanced budget. And that's what most people remember. But there's a second part of that, and that has to do with taxes, licenses, and fees. And basically, the second part of the Hancock Amendment says no tax, license, or fee can be raised without voter approval. If you drive around Springfield, any time of year, there'll be a quarter-cent sales tax sign, a little penny with a quarter taken out of it, and that would be for improvements of intersections and roads and so on. And every couple of years, the citizens of Springfield have to vote to renew that tax. That's because of the second part of the Hancock Amendment. Again, if somebody says, does Missouri have a balanced budget amendment? Yes, it's the Hancock Amendment. But in terms of the day-to-day taxation policies of the state, of the counties, of the city of Springfield, library districts, that's right here, the tax, licenses, and fees. And so that's just kind of an overview of the history. So let's talk about the process itself. If you wanted to take your clipboard to the library center, what would you want to do? You know, what's your initiative? So we're just going to spend a little time here on the process itself. Now, it starts with you, George. You're going to be our person with a clipboard. George is going to come up with his initiative, his thing that he wants. Do you want a statute, a law, or do you want to go all the way to a constitutional amendment? George wants the constitutional amendment, so we'll go all the way. So, the first part, George would submit the text of his law or constitutional amendment to the Secretary of State's office. We're not to the signature stage yet. Here's the law, here's the constitutional amendment, and you submit that to the Secretary of State's office. The Secretary of State, Part 2, will write a summary and provide a title. A summary, remember we talked about the other day, where do the lawsuits come from? And we'll talk about this again in a little bit. The lawsuits come sometimes at the Secretary of State's office on the summary and sometimes the title of the bill. So the Secretary of State's office will write a summary of the bill or constitutional amendment and provide a title. Third, the auditor well, let's just go with note. The auditor, the state auditor, again, an elected executive branch office holder, the auditor writes a fiscal impact statement or fiscal note. Here's Georgia's constitutional amendment. It has to go to the auditor so that the auditor can say, if we pass this amendment, it will cost the state taxpayers this amount of money. Now, ideally, George, how much do you want this to cost? And the answer would be zero. That's right. You want your auditor's fiscal note to say zero. But if you're proposing something that's going to cost money, then the auditor's note is going to reflect that. Now, sometimes it's easier to figure out than not. We have one example we're going to talk about a little bit later. So the auditor's note. Now, once you have a summary, a title, and a fiscal note, then you can circulate your petitions. So basically, George gets his clipboard, and he gets Joni all fired up about this constitutional amendment, and Janice is fired up. Jim's not too enthusiastic, but he's going to go along with the crowd, and everybody fans out. Now, how far do you have to fan out? Well, to get on a statewide ballot, you have to fan out statewide. And so let me give you the statistics themselves. There is no how many signatures do you need. There is no such number. The number of signatures is determined by the number of people, total number of people who voted in the last gubernatorial election. Number of signatures is determined by the vote, and I'm going to keep going, in the last gubernatorial election. So, how many people voted for governor last time? That's your number. And in order to get an initiative on the ballot, 5% for a statute or a law. Now, statute. And in Georgia's case, because it's a constitutional amendment, it's 8%. 8% of the total. Now, there's one additional wrinkle. It's 5% for a statute, 8% for a constitutional amendment, but not 5% or 8% in the state. It's 5 or 8% in 2/3 of the congressional districts in the state of Missouri. Now, basically what this means is you can't take your clipboard and go down to the library in St. Louis and in Kansas City. You have to get that 5 or 8% in a majority of the congressional districts in the state. So it can't just be driven by the urban areas where you can find all the signatures. In order to get on a statewide ballot, you have to get statewide signatures. Statewide. Now, so there is no requisite number. There is no requisite number. It's based, the number for 2000 whatever is based on the previous gubernatorial election, and that number is going to be different after the next gubernatorial election. So people ask all the time, is there a number? That would be a good exam question. The number is none of the above, because it varies. So you can go with 5%, 8% in 2/3. Those numbers change. There is no number. Now, ultimately, all of those signatures have to be verified, valid, and so on. I don't think that level of detail is necessary for us, but the process, submit the text, get a summary and title, get a fiscal note, circulate your petitions. I'm going to assume that George is going to do this above board and all of his signatures are going to be valid, and then that initiative for that constitutional amendment goes on the ballot for all of you to vote on. That's the process. Questions about the process? Okay, let's do what you used to do in well, high school, grade school. Let's talk about current events. Okay, they're not really current, but 2010 was an interesting year for initiatives and referendums. Let's call it 2010, even though it's not really current events. 2010, the voters of Missouri considered 3 statutory proposals. And the voters considered 3 constitutional amendments. They all passed. All 3 of the statutes passed, all 3 of the constitutional amendments passed. But, Jim, I heard that. I hate it when you say but, because there's always more. There's always more. 3 statutory passed, 3 constitutional amendment passed, but there were 20 other initiatives in circulation during 2010. Basically, and George, this will give you something to think about before you get your clipboard and go down to the Library Center. There were 20 initiatives that went to this initial stage, got the summary and title, got the fiscal note, and began the circulation process. 20. And they never made it to the ballot. So, basically, of the 26 proposals that were out there, only 6 out of 20 made it. And so, George, this is something for you to think about. What happened here? What happened? A couple of different possibilities. The first is, you just quit. You've realized how hard it was. Nobody liked your idea. Joni and Janice, but the rest of the people were more like Jim and said, So you just quit. You got your petitions approved, but you didn't go anywhere further. Sometimes they are formally withdrawn. We're going to formally disband. We're going to formally not circulate these petitions anymore. One of the most likely candidates here would be not enough signatures. You just didn't get enough signatures. So you needed, I'm making this up, you needed 1,000, you got 900. And so that was it. You couldn't make the threshold. So again, that 5%, 8% in 2/3 of the congressional district, it's a pretty high hurdle to get over. And so, George, I know you're going to work hard, but you may not get the number of signatures. Now, the last option, or why these don't make it, is not the number of signatures, but the number of valid signatures. So, Joni is out there getting petitions signed, get the address, well, they're not a registered voter, or they're not a registered voter in the county, they're not a registered voter in the congressional district, they're not a citizen of Missouri, and so on and so forth. So we're assuming what happens, not assuming, what happens most of the time, you need 200 votes, you submit 200, or signatures, you submit 250. You need 1,000, you submit 1,400 on the outside chance that some of them are not valid. But it has happened. A petition can be circulated and can be rejected, not because of the number, but the number of valid signatures. So, 2010 was a busy year for statutory and for constitutional amendments, but it was even busier if you think about all of the petitions that are being circulated. You go down to the Library Center, it's like, Girl Scouts selling cookies. Who gets there first? So, George, you go down there and there's somebody already there and they're circulating their petition. So you go someplace else and there's somebody already there. So this is an increasingly used process, and we'll talk about why when we get through there just a second. So just be thinking about how common the initiative and referendum process is today. I'm sorry, Joni? Oh, all right. What are the odds, you mean, of this happening, 3 for 3 and 3 for 3? The odds are not very high, but that's a good question, and we'll just talk about that right now. Let me move over here and run out of space again. I think there's really two things to think about in terms of what are your odds? And I think there's two questions. What are your odds of getting on the ballot? And I think that's what we're talking about here. What are the odds of you actually completing this process and getting on the ballot? Well, that's a pretty high bar. Okay, let's say you're on the ballot. What are the odds of that actually happening, of you actually passing? And if you look at history, 2010 would be what you'd say in statistics would be an outlier. The odds of going 3 for 3 and 3 for 3, historically speaking, going all the way back to that first one in 1920, the odds of going 3 for 3 are not very good. 2010 sticks out, and I'll come back to that in just a second, but right now, 2010 looks different than the history of the initiative process. Let me talk a little bit about that. What are the success rates? And well, I break this down really into two parts. Voters, you guys, are much more likely or much more receptive to a constitutional amendment. All right, you are more receptive to a constitutional amendment. So, if we're choosing between the two things, constitutional amendment and statute, you're more receptive to passing a constitutional amendment. Now, constitutional amendment can be proposed two ways. You can propose it with your clipboards, or it can come from the General Assembly. You are much more receptive, okay? You're more receptive to a constitutional amendment. You're more receptive still, let's call that more squared. You're even more receptive if it comes from the General Assembly. Well, always capitalize. So in terms of what are the odds of passage, you are more likely to pass a constitutional amendment than a statute. You are more likely to pass a constitutional amendment that is submitted by the General Assembly than one that was submitted by George to personify this. Now, a good example, probably the best example, or a couple of good examples would be 1992, the Crime Victim Bill of Rights. If you are the victim of a crime, 1992, the legislature passes a constitutional amendment and submits it to you to vote on. Crime Victim Bill of Rights guarantees you, the victim, has rights. We talked about it early in the semester. Somebody's in jail coming up from parole. You, the victim, has a right to know that. That sort of thing. Think Shawshank Redemption and you'll probably get the right idea. 2004, Missouri's definition of marriage. This came from the legislature and it was overwhelmingly supported by the people. And this is also true for 2008, with English being the official language of the state of Missouri. Not quite in English only, but the English being the official language, is a constitutional amendment that came from the legislature. So you're more likely to pass a constitutional amendment, especially if it came from the legislature, like the 1992 Crime Victim Bill of Rights, 2004 definition of marriage is between a man and a woman, and 2008 English as the official language of the state of Missouri. Now, it goes without saying that you are not as receptive to statutory proposals. And I'm just going to put, well, I'll just put statutory proposals. That's what I'll put because that's what I said. You are less likely to vote in favor of statutory proposals. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this. The General Assembly, when they can't decide things and they send it to you, it's going to be controversial. And I have more to say about that in just a second. But a statute is on the statewide initiative. If it came from the General Assembly, it's more likely to have been controversial. And the best example of that is the 1999 Conceal and Carry statute that was proposed by the legislature. Now, this has changed, but in 1999, the General Assembly said, you, the citizens of Missouri, need to vote on this conceal and carry because it was controversial. The ban, this was a ban in 1999, it was a ban on concealed weapons, a ban or conceal and carry ban. And that ban passed. That ban passed. Conceal and carry was not allowed after 1999. Now again, this has changed, but I want you to think about this in terms of the controversy. Why did the legislature pass it on to you? Well, it was controversial. 52-48. I mean, you can get a measure of how controversial that might have been. It must have been in the legislature because it was so controversial. 2 percentage points the other way. Now, this has been overturned, and I have something to say about that later, but 1999, the legislature passed a controversial measure onto you. And so they are not as likely to pass because they are more likely to be controversial. So that's reason number one that you don't like statutes. Reason number two is initiative supporters. If this is a statute that came from you guys, if it's an initiative proposal, then let's talk about George. Let's make fun of George some more. People who support an initiative, a statutory initiative, are intense, okay? It's intense support. George is all fired up about some particular issue. One of my personal favorites is to bring Amtrak service back to Springfield. People get intense in their support of that particular issue. So it's intense support. But in order to pass muster, it has to have broad-based statewide support. So George may be fired up. Joni is fired up to help him. Janice is fired up, but you need to convince a majority of the voters statewide. And so the initiative supporters are intense, but not necessarily widespread. Now, let me give you some examples and give you some numbers. I really need a bigger board. Write that down. I need a bigger board. All right, intense support versus widespread support. Probably two good examples. Maybe one is not as good as the other. 2004 gambling amendment. This would be in nearby Rockaway Beach. And I have a little bit to say about this later as well, but gambling was proposed for Rockaway Beach down near Branson. And the supporters of this were intense, but they didn't generate broad statewide support. And so gambling in Rockaway Beach lost 44 to 56%. There was intense support for gambling, but not statewide support for gambling in Rockaway Beach. Now, a better example is probably the 911 cell phone tax. $911 cell phone tax. 2002, it was proposed to tax cell phones to provide 911 service. 911 service, I'm sorry, 2002. 2002, 9/11 cell phone tax. Tax on cell phone service to provide 9/11 services statewide. Very intense support for it, lost pretty big, 35 to 65%. I think this is probably my better example. Cell phone tax to support 9/11 had some intense supporters. Had some intense supporters in a variety of different state agencies even to fund the 9/11 centers, but ultimately intense support didn't translate into statewide support. So the odds of passing are not good. 2010 is probably an anomaly, but 2010 could also be the beginning of something new. I mean, we're trying to figure out whether 2010, 2011, 2012 look more like the past or more like the future, and it's probably too early to tell. But that's what we do. We look at the past history. Does 2010 look like the previous 50 years or 100 years? And the answer is no. That success rate, 3 for 3, is too high. On the other hand, that may be the portent of things to come. So it may look like the initiative referendum process may look like 2010 more in the future. So that leaves us with one last question. If 2010, with the 20 circulated petitions and the 3 for 3 and 3 for 3, if this is what the future of initiatives and referendums look like, it's probably worth asking right now whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, ultimately it comes down to how much democracy do you want? How much control of state government, of the state constitution, do you want in the hands of the citizen of Missouri? Jim, do you want your roommate to amend the constitution of the state? Jim says no. Now, Jim doesn't trust his roommate. The question is, how much do you trust the people of Missouri? So I think it's worth spending a little bit of time on the pros and cons. You know, we tend to think about this on the pro side of democracy. The power is in your hands. But I think there's a fair argument to be made for both sides. Now, much of what I'm saying here, I've stolen from a political scientist whose name is Dave Valentine, associated with Mizzou, but we try to forgive that from him, of him. And what Dave has lined up pretty much are the pros and cons of the initiative referendum process. And I'll say it now. The answer is, which is it, pro or con? It's both. But I want you to be aware that there are positive aspects of the initiative referendum process, and I want you to be aware that there are some negative aspects as well. And I'm going to save one for a future lecture, so we're going to focus on three on both sides. So 3 arguments in favor of the initiative referendum process, and three arguments against. Now, I am oversimplifying. Again, 100 level class, 1 hour course. Valentine makes 5, 6 arguments on both sides with the equivalent number of examples. I think we can simplify this and you get the gist of it. Number 1, on the pro side, the initiative referendum process encourages citizens to be more politically active. We encourage citizens to be more politically active. And this goes back to what we said about democracy. The power is in your hands. This is just one more aspect of Missouri government, one more chance for you to take a stand and make your voice heard in state government. So the initiative or referendum process is that one more step, that one more thing that allows you, encourages you to participate politically. The second positive thing is the initiative or referendum process allows you to bypass what I would call a reluctant legislature. We have a Republican form of government, elected representatives. You elect the representatives to represent you. You elect the representatives to do things. Well, what about when they don't do what you want them to do? The initiative or referendum process allows you, in football it would be called an end around. The initiative and referendum process allows you to go around the legislature if the legislature is keeping you from getting what you want. And the granddaddy of all examples is the 1940 Missouri Plan. We talked about it earlier as the most famous of the initiatives, and this is why. Missouri was the first to adopt the Missouri Plan, but the Missouri Plan was adopted over the objections of the legislature. The Pendergast machine was so corrupt, the people were so outraged that we went to a merit selection system. But the merit selection system took power away from the political party. And anything that took power away from the elected officials was going to be suspect in Jefferson City. So the legislature refused to pass anything that looked like a merit system. Refused to pass, refused to pass. Finally, you said, all right, enough. We're going to take our clipboards down to the library center, and we're going to do this on our own. And in 1940, you passed the Missouri Plan over the objections of the legislature. What did the legislature do? They sued. They say, you can't do that. Ultimately, the courts sided with you, the citizen of Missouri. So the initiative and referendum process allows you to get around a legislature that's not doing what you elect them to do. And the 1940 court plan is the best example of that. The third thing that Dave Valentine talks about is enhancing the legitimacy of the legislature or state government in general. And I'm going to run out of space here, so I won't write it on the wall. I'll just say it out loud. We talked about it before, but my example for this is 1992 term limits. You have to go back to 1992. Now, some of you are actually alive, but you have to go back to 1992 and get the mood of the country in 1992. And the mood of the country was suspicious. In particular, suspicious of everything that was going on in Washington. Congressmen were bouncing checks. Congressmen were stealing stamps. Congressmen were abusing their privileges, and we need to do something about it. The root of all evil in 1992 was incumbency. And the best way to guarantee to throw the bums out is to impose term limits. And in 1992, amidst all of that suspicion, the voters of Missouri imposed term limits in Jefferson City. And the idea here is to return to a citizen legislature. The 1992 term limit enactment is a way for you, the citizen of Missouri, to see your government as more legitimate. It's people like you serving your best interest. It's not people in Jefferson City in the House and the Senate year after year after year after year succumbing to all of the bad and evil things that power has. So in 1992, you enhance the legitimacy of state government by passing the term limits. All right, 3 good, simple examples, and also 3 con, or what are the things that are bad about initiatives and referendums. And I think number 1 for Valentine is weakens representative government. And I'm sorry if this requires you to actually put on your thinking caps, but it'll make sense here in just a second. We elect representatives to represent us. We elect representatives to do things for us. Well, the initiative or referendum process allows the legislature to pawn that decision off on you. The legislature could make the decision, but they send it to you in the form of a statute. Now, I'll just give you the best example, and that would be conceal and carry. We just talked about it. The legislature was unwilling to make this decision. Yeah, I know it was controversial, but what makes it so controversial? Well, I've got to run for re-election. I know, let's let the people decide. And so instead of standing up for or against conceal and carry, that is pawned off on the voters. It's democratic, but basically allows the legislature not to make the decision. So the argument that Valentine makes is that weakens representative government. If you're just going to do it yourself, or they're going to pawn it off on you, why do we need representatives in the first place? So that's number one. Number two, and for a lack of a better term, Valentine argues that many of the initiatives that are proposed, many of the statutory initiatives, as well as the constitutional amendments, are, in a sense, too technical for the average Missourian. That the ballot summary is one thing, but what does it all mean? I think we use the example of the Greene County, when Greene County went into the merit system with respect to the Missouri plan. I would venture to say that most people, had they known what they were voting for, would have voted against it in Greene County. I'm not the only one who thinks that, but the argument that Valentine makes is that the initiative language, the ballot summary, and the title are insufficient. And even if they were sufficient, the average Missouri voter doesn't take the amount of time necessary to be educated to make a good or a bad decision. So the argument is they're too technical, and I think the best two examples of that are probably in 2008. There was an initiative proposed on stormwater financing. How do you finance stormwater projects? Well, I'm pretty sure I didn't understand it, and I'm pretty sure the average Missouri voter didn't understand it as well. And I think this is also true probably for the 1990, one of my favorites, the Natural Streams Act. And the Natural Streams Act had a lot to do with what landowners could and could not do with streams that ran through their private property. The ballot summary was okay, but it didn't do the technical detail of the Natural Streams Act justice. Most people were bamboozled by the language of that initiative. And so Valentine argues that, you know, it's okay to let people decide some things, but some of these things are too technical to be determined. Now, the last thing, I'm going to run out of space, the last thing that Valentine points to, so I'll put number 3 on the con, this is number 3 on the con. The last thing that Valentine points to is, even when the language is crystal clear, even when it is simple, even when it's black and white and absolutely clear, sometimes public opinion in Missouri makes you wonder. And we'll just go ... Valentine ends this discussion at the cons. Sometimes public opinion makes you wonder. And let me just give you 2 examples of what he's talking about. He had one, but let me give you another one. In 1998, 570,000 Missouri voters, 570,000 Missouri voters voted to keep cockfighting legal in the state of Missouri. 1998, almost 600,000 citizens thought it was a good idea that cockfighting was legal. Now, cockfighting in 1998 was banned, but to think that almost 600,000 people thought it was okay is what causes Dave Valentine to say it kind of makes you wonder about whether we should let the citizens of Missouri make this decision. The better example, or maybe the best example, is the 1976 constitutional amendment to eliminate segregated schools. Now, we're going to have to do a little math here. In 1976, the Missouri Constitution still mandated segregated schools. Now, 1976 minus 1954. Carol, why 1954? No. Joni? Brown versus Board of Education. You had them reversed, Carol. Brown versus Board of Education. In 1954, the United States Supreme Court says segregated schools are unconstitutional. Okay, let's do the math. 6 minus 4 is 2, 7 minus 5 is 2. Okay, 1976, 22 years after the Supreme Court said segregated schools were unconstitutional, the Missouri Constitution still mandated segregated schools. Somebody said, maybe we should take that out. So in 1976, an amendment was proposed to eliminate segregated schools from the Constitution. Now, Janice, it passed. It passed. It's not that bad, but it passed. Now, but let's talk about the numbers. Yes, this constitutional amendment to remove segregated schools passed. It passed 57% to 43%. Now, that's just percentages. Let's talk about numbers. The 57 is approximately 598,000. 598,000 voters as compared to 442,000 voters. What does that mean? That means that 442,000 voters thought that Missouri should mandate segregated schools 22 years after the Brown versus Board of Education. Again, that's the kind of thing that makes Dave Valentine wonder. Now, if you think about it, that's a difference of 156,000 voters, 156,000 voters out of over 1 million that were cast. I mean, by percentage-wise, 57 versus 43, it looks pretty clear-cut, and it is, but the margin is 156,000. It's not a lot of people. Now, ultimately, if you think about the counties, there are 114 counties in the state of Missouri. All right, here's the people. 57% overall versus 43%, 598,000 versus 442. 114 counties. This amendment lost in 54 counties. I'm going to run out of space. Lost in 54 counties. About half of the counties in Missouri in 1976 voted to keep segregated schools in the Constitution. That's the kind of thing that makes Dave Valentine wonder whether this is the kind of thing that we should let the people of Missouri decide. But ultimately, it comes down to you. Again, it's for you to decide. Is 2010, 3 for 3, 3 for 3, and all of those initiatives being circulated, is that the way you want to move forward? Is it the pro side, the democracy side, that outweighs the con side in your minds? You are going to have to decide. So, initiatives and referendums is the thing du jour. It is incredibly common, and we've only talked about the state level initiatives and referendums. There's a slew of things that go on at the local level. And this is going to be increasingly common. As long as you live in the state of Missouri, you're going to see this more and more and more. And we'll talk about why in an upcoming class period. So, questions about any of this? Okay, thanks very much.